So keeping the shoulder blades and the head down, we're gonna feel some movement in the sacrum. So as you inhale, you'll lift that low back up off the ground. And then exhale, flatten the low back like you're trying to curl the tailbone under toward the ceiling. And keep arching and rounding the low back. So we're letting the pelvis leave neutral and tip forward and back to start to free up the tissues at the low back. Moving with the breath. Find your neutral position, sacrum on the ground. Push into those big toes, use the glutes to lift yourself up into low bridge. Draw those pelvic points in, stay pretty low here so that we're really feeling the glutes lift the hips. And we'll slowly lower down one vertebra at a time. So we're gonna keep segmentally lifting into bridge, one vertebra at a time, pausing at the top, really using the glutes. And then lowering down as slowly as we can, and really try to slow that down as you get to the very end near the pelvis so that we can eke out as much space in the low back as possible. The next time we come to the top of our bridge pose, we'll stay there, really pushing into the big toes. Bring your hands to your front ribs for a moment and just hold them in. So make sure they're not lifting up toward the ceiling, but we're just pulling them slightly in toward the body, keeping the glutes working to extend the hips, getting as long as we can in the low back. And one final time, we'll lower down as slowly as possible until we get that sacrum on the mat. And from there, hands will interlace behind the head. Get the elbows to come in as much as you can toward the forehead. Big breath into the sides of the rib cage. Exhale, pull the belly down, pull the ribs down as you lift off the shoulder blades. Let the head feel heavy, like you're leaning your head back into your hands. Inhale and lower. Exhale, lift up, feel the ribs pull down and in toward the body. Head leans back into the hands, draw those pelvic points in. Inhale to lower. Exhale, lift. Lean your head back, pull the belly down. This time, without changing the low back, we pick up the right foot, knee over the hip. Don't let the low back arch or flatten. Lower the right foot down. Inhale and lower. Exhale, lift up. Don't worry about lifting off the head. Let it lean back into the hands. Pelvic points draw in. Pick up the left foot without changing the low back. Left foot lowers. Inhale and lower down. One more round. Exhale, lift up. Lean your head back. Feel those front ribs knitting in. Take up the right foot, knee over the hip. Nothing changes in the low back. Can you push into the left big toe and lift the left heel? Keep pulling the belly button down toward the mat. Heel lowers, right foot lowers. Inhale to lower the rest of the way. Last one, exhale, lift up. Let the head feel heavy in the hands, chin is slightly toward the throat without changing the low back. Pick up the left foot, knee over the hip. Sacrum stays down, and you lift the right heel. Pull the belly down. Lower the right heel, the left foot. Inhale and lower. Release that. We're gonna pick up our right foot. You can have the knee bent or straight. Let's point and flex a couple times, getting some ankle dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. Now bend the knee, so we're in that same position, right knee over the hip. Hip is flexed. Take your fingers right into that right hip crease, so right where the right thigh meets the hip. And let's feel the rotation here at the top of that right thigh bone as we internally and externally rotate this right hip. So make sure that we're feeling the movement come from the hip and not by wiggling or shifting the low back side to side. Cross it over for figure 4. That's external rotation of the hip. Skull, shoulder blades, and sacrum are down. If it feels good, right hand can come to that right thigh and push away a little bit. Take your left hand and bring it somewhere on your rib cage. It could be the front ribs, it could be the left side ribs. And as we stay here and breathe, let's feel that expansion into the ribs, wherever your hand is. On the inhale, ribs expand. Breathe into the lowest ribs you can. Release that right foot down. Recheck that triple S. Pick up the left foot as bent or straight as you'd like while we point and flex that left foot. So getting some ankle mobility. Dorsiflexion is when we pull the toes back. Plantar flexion is when we point the toes. Bend the knee so that left knee is over the hip. Left fingers come right into that hip crease as we rotate the hip joint externally and internally. Nothing else changes, so we shouldn't feel like we're wiggling anywhere else, just moving at this left hip. And now we cross it over, figure four. Feel that the front ribs haven't popped up, shoulder blades are still down. Left hand can come to the left thigh. If you want to have right hand somewhere on the ribs, use that as some feedback to really inhale and expand the ribs front, side, and back. Release it down. Let's hug both knees in. You can have the hands hugging the legs. You can have hands out to the side, and we'll just rock on the sacrum side to side. So this is a little bit of movement and a little bit of rotation for the lumbar spine, but it's really small. Let's make our way into a seated position, however you want to get there. And we'll check in with that feeling of our triple S, broom right behind the back. Good. Hands come forward. Let's spread the fingers. Start at the pinkies. Try to lower just the pinkies. Just the fourth finger, middle finger, index finger, and thumb. And then we pull those knuckles back in. Take a big breath in and out. Circle the wrist a couple times both ways. And we'll head on to quadruped. So coming onto hands and knees, we're going to line up with the shoulders right over the wrist crease. You could also be on fist. And we'll start with some hip circles here. So part of really loving our low back is mobilizing the hips without moving the low back. So unweight your right knee in quadruped. It's just hovering off the ground. Let's try to circle the hip here. So it does look like we're circling with the knee, but the movement is being initiated in that right hip joint. So the top of that right thigh bone is where the circles are starting. You could also balance your yoga block here on your sacrum, making sure we're not moving in the low back. Right knee comes back down. Recheck that triple S. So neutral spine, unweight the left knee, and let's circle here, both ways without involving the lower back. So nothing is moving besides this left hip and left leg. Arms are straight and strong. Right hip is really active, working to stabilize. And back to quadruped. Let's come on to the fist just to give the wrist a little bit of a break because we're going to stay here. So you can come to fist. If you feel fine on your hands, you can stay there. And we'll do some segmental cat-cow. So kind of like our segmental bridge, we're going to move really slowly. I want you to start with just cat-cowing the lower back, just like our pelvic tilts. So we're just doing the pelvis and the low back. So as we tip forward, our belly is kind of dropping, tailbone tips up. As we tip backwards, we tuck that tailbone under, but try not to let the movement happen in the rest of the spine yet. We're just trying to unstick this low back area. And now let's make it bigger. Get the rest of the spine involved as we cat-cow. As much movement as you can, both ways, extension and flexion in the spine. Heading to down dog. Weight stays in the hands, spine stays long as we tuck the toes, lift those hips straight up toward the ceiling, let the feet walk in, big bend in the knees. We're gonna have the heels really lifted so we can swivel. So really press into the fingers, knees and toes turn to one side, but the shoulders don't turn and the chest doesn't rotate. And then we turn the knees and toes the other way. So as slowly as it feels good, you just let the lower half of your body swivel side to side. But the upper back is staying nice and long. Our shoulders aren't moving. So all of this little swivel is just happening from the pelvis and the hips down below. So we're getting this nice pull on the tissues in the low back and the sides of the waist. Walk your hands back towards your feet, happy squat. Let the heels lower all the way down as you continue to push into the big toes. So that's that dorsiflexion of the ankles. We're in our hip hinge where our torso is trying to touch the thighs. Give your glutes a nice squeeze as you rise up. Good, coming back into that hip extension on our way back up. And as we rise up, let's check in with that triple S. We want that neutral. We're gonna walk our way forward with some hip hinges. So hands are gonna start right at the front of the hips. Slide the hands down as far as you can go without rounding. So that's that flexion of the hip. We don't want to be moving in the low back. Keep it long. Push the ground away as you rise up. As you rise up, let's flex our left hip. Pick up that left foot, firm the right glute. Now step it forward. Pick up the right foot. Step your feet together this time. So hip hinge again. Hands slide down. As long as you can in the spines, we don't want to be rounding or arching. Push the ground away, use the glutes to get back up. This time we lift right foot first. Flexing the hip, keep it low enough that we're not moving through the low back. So we're not tucking under here. Low back stays long. Step it forward, pick up the left foot. Feet step together, back into that hip hinge. Hands slide down, spine stays long. Weight stays in the big toes and heels. Rise up using the glutes with that broom behind your back. Pick up the left foot. Keep it as low as you need. Step it forward. Pick up the right foot. Spine stays long. Step it forward. We should be getting close to the front of the mat if we're not already there. Let's do one more hip hinge. Using the glutes on the way back up. Push into the feet. Good. And forward and up. Bend the knees first. Think about your low back staying super long as you hinge all the way forward. Long, long, long by bending the knees. Come to a quadruped. Hands and knees. Back of the neck is long. Chin is slightly toward the throat. We tuck the toes. Cover the knees up without rounding or changing the low back. So really tapping into that deep core. Lower the knees again. You can untuck the toes. Right foot will step forward. Left knee stays down, 90-90 lunge. Let's zipper that pubic bone up. So make sure the low back isn't tipping forward. We don't want to be arching the low back. So it should feel nice and long, tailbone to the heels, left glute firm. Fists come together, or knuckles together. We're going to turn just the ribs without any rotation happening at the hips or the low back. So it might be an inch or two, and then bring it back. Left glute stays firm as we rotate to the right without turning in the low back. So the whole time our ribs are turning, our tailbone isn't changing. It's still lengthening straight down. So we're not twisting here, just the ribs. Bring the hands back down or come to fist, three-legged quadruped. Right leg back. Find that triple S here. You can have toes on the ground or off the ground. We'll start by abducting the right hip. So keep the toes facing the ground. Right leg moves slightly to the right. Hip abduction away from the body. Now we're going to do the opposite. Cross it behind you over toward the left. Hip adduction, but don't let anything change in the back. So we abduct out to the right. Adduct over to the left. Nothing is moving. We're lifting the belly up toward the low back. We're strong and active in both arms. This time we bring it out to the right in abduction. We'll step that right foot all the way out to the right for an adductor rock. Try to push into that full right foot, and we'll start to rock back and forth as slowly and as gently as you need. Keep that long spine here. So we're trying to stay as long and spacious in the low back as we can. So if you feel like it's tight or shortened, really pay attention to what's happening at the pelvis. We might be tipping forward. So use the help of the core. Bring it back into quadruped, and we'll switch left foot steps forward for low lunge. Lift up. Check in. We've got ears over the shoulders, shoulders over the ribs, ribs over the pelvis. Right glute is firm. Fists come together. Really visualize just the rib cage rotating. Turn 1 or 2 inches left. Squeeze that right glute a little bit, and then come back. Rotate left. Don't let the pelvis change. And keep going with a small rotation to the left. And the whole time we're thinking about that pubic bone lifting up toward the belly. So stay nice and neutral in the pelvis. This time we come back to center. Three-legged quadruped. Left leg back, toes face the ground, neutral spine. Keep the low back still as we abduct the left leg to the left and adduct the left leg over toward the right. So that's probably going to be a pretty small movement. Don't worry about what it looks like or how big it is. We're going for stability here. So we don't want to be moving in the low back. Don't let it arch. So you want to keep that belly lifted. You're using those deep core stabilizers. Working the outer hips, but staying long in the low back. This time, as we bring the leg out to the left, we'll plant it down for that adductor stretch, starting to rock back and forth as gently as it feels good. Using that 360 breath, try to feel that expansion into the lowest ribs that you can. Bring it back into quadruped, your choice. You can take a child's pose of some kind. You could move around in cat-cow, mobilizing the spine. You could take down dog. Anything that feels good while we focus on that expansive breath into the side and back ribs. Big bend in your knees. Let's walk it forward, keeping that feeling of a broom behind your back. So bring the hands as high onto the legs as you need. Push the ground away. Use the glutes to get back up. Lift those shoulder blades. Bend the knees. Let's stay long as possible. Hinging forward. Quadruped. Hands and knees. Align that triple S. Low back stays long as we tuck the toes. Hover the knees. Hovering quadruped. Lift the belly up. Lower the knees back down. You can untuck the toes. Right foot steps forward. Left toes tuck under. Low lunge. Pause here. Zipper that pubic bone up. We're super strong in that left glute. Hands will come behind the head. If you want to have anything under that left knee to make it more comfortable, you're welcome to put a pillow or a block there. Let's open the chest by flaring the elbows. Now, without the ribs doing the moving, can you slightly lift your chest? So just the collarbone is lifting up, but the ribs aren't lifting. So a little bit of thoracic upper back extension. Let's do the opposite. Elbows in, chin lowers down. You can spread those shoulder blades apart a little bit. Lift up, flare the elbows, lift the chest up without the ribs moving forward. So we still have to hug those ribs in. And then elbows in, round the back, spinal flexion. Come back up. Hands or fists come down under the shoulders. Three-legged quadruped, right leg back. Lift the belly up. You can bend the knee like we usually do for our hip rotation. You could also try it with a straight-ish leg, however straight it feels good. And let's roll that right thigh bone out to the side, out to the right. That's external rotation. And then roll that right thigh bone in toward the body, internal rotation. So let's try to move just like we did on our back with the fingers in the hip crease. Feel that that hip is moving, but our low back isn't moving. So that supporting hip and knee are really strong and still. Good, lower it back to quadruped. Left foot steps forward, tuck the right toes, low lunge, zipper that pubic bone, ears over the shoulders, over the ribs, over the pelvis. Hands behind the head. Open the elbows, lift the chest, but imagine somebody's hand holding your ribs in place. So we're getting that upper back extension. Elbows in, round the back, let the chin lower, but we don't change what's happening in the pelvis or the lower back. One more time each way. Lift the chest, flare those elbows without popping the ribs. Elbows in, really squeeze that right glute as you round the back. Big pull on that right hip. Come back up. Hands come down, three-legged quadruped. Left leg back. Now, if you want to balance something here on the sacrum, you can. Lift the belly up toward the sacrum, lengthen the spine. Externally and internally, rotate that left hip. So hold really strong in this right hip and glute. That's gonna help us not wiggle here and stay a little bit more stable. So when it comes to the low back, we really want to get in the brain and the body that when we want to move the hips, the low back does not do the job of the hips. Just the hips are rotating. Lower to quadruped, your choice. Child's pose if that feels nice to give some space to the low back. Maybe cat-cow if you want to move and mobilize. You could, of course, swivel in your down dog if that's what feels good. Let's walk it forward. Bent knee, forward fold. Push down into your feet, lengthen the spine. Use your glutes to get back up. Shoulder blades lift. Hands come down. We're gonna step our right foot back, high lunge. Pausing here, hands can come front and back of the pelvis. Let's check that the low back is not arching or over tucking. So we want the low back and the tailbone to feel really long. Now let's add a little bit of movement. Can we flex here, which is torso coming toward the left thigh. Keep that low back as long as you can. So don't worry about how far you go. Use that hand at the back of the pelvis to make sure nothing's changing there. And then really push into that left foot to come back up. Now we tap the right toes forward, staying long in the low back. Pick up the right foot any amount. Don't let the movement come from the back. So nothing changes. It can stay low. Tap it back. And then back to your lunge. We're going to keep the hands here to make sure we're not moving the pelvis. Now we go back to that tilt here. Our torso comes toward the left thigh. That's flexing the left hip. Push down to rise back up. We tap the right toes forward. And then flex the right hip. Pick up that right thigh. Don't let the back do the movement of the hip. So just coming from the front of the hip flexing. Tap down, back to your lunge. Let's do that one more time. Hinge forward, so flexing at the left hip. Rising back up with that long low back. Tap forward. And now we flex the right hip. Thigh to the torso without changing the spine. Tap it down. Back to your lunge. And this time from our lunge, we turn to the side of the mat. Heels in. Toes out to your amount of external rotation. Bend the knees for a squat. Let's make sure knees and toes face the same way. Zipper that pubic bone up so we're not tipping forward here. Check for any of that grumpiness in the low back. It should be nice and long. Arms reach out. We'll side bend to the right. So right arm can just rest on the leg or stay at the hip. Left arm comes up and over. We're getting a nice pull on the left side, especially between the left side of the ribs and left side of the pelvis. And then back to your center position. Left arm comes down, right arm comes up and over. We side bend left. Bring it back up. Let's do that one more time. Side bend to the right, each way. Zipper the pubic bone up. Stay long in the low back. Back to center. Side bend to the left. Right arm up and over. Tailbones reaching to the ground. Bring it back up. Straighten the legs. And let's step it back to the front of the mat. We'll do that whole sequence with the left foot back. Pause here. Zipper up. Hands come front and back. Now you can really use the hands to kind of squeeze in. Hold it stable. So we've got to practice that pelvic stability. Start with that hinge. Torso comes toward the right thigh. So our right hip is kind of moving back. Belly to the thigh. Push the ground away as you come back up. Tap the left toes forward. And now we flex the left hip, but keep that hand at the sacrum. Make sure you're not feeling the movement come from the lower back. Tap it down. Back to your lunge, landing softly with that left glute. Hinge forward, flex the right hip, spine stays long. Push into that right foot to get back up. Tap forward. Push into that right big toe, flex the left hip, so right glute is firm. Tap it down, we're gonna do that one more time. Tap it back, low back stays long. Hold that neutral pelvis as you tilt forward. Picture that broom behind you. Push the ground away, rise up. Tap forward. Pick up the left foot. Flexing the left hip. Don't let the low back do the moving for you. Tap it down. And then back to your lunge. From here, let's turn to the left. Coming into that squat. Hips are externally rotated, but we're not tipping forward. We're not overly tucking under. And we'll add those side bends. So either way, first, we're going to side bend. Really breathe into the space between your ribs and your pelvis. So this kind of side waist area, we're getting a little more space there. And then switch, side bend the other way. Breathe into that area between the ribs and the pelvis. One more each way, side bend. Low back stays long as we mobilize above. Pelvis stays neutral. Lift it back up. Last one, side bend. Zipper that pubic bone up. Keep the ribs in. Good. Back to center. Good. Let's step it forward again. We're going to do some staggered hip hinges. So our right foot is going to step a little bit further back. Now, if I'm facing this way, you can have a really narrow stance. You can have a wider stance with the feet further apart. It's whatever feels more stable. We're going to soften the knees and check right away that we're not tipping forward here and locking out the knees. So we've got to bend the knees, tailbone down, pubic bone up, find that triple S, and then hands slide down. Long spine all the way down. Hip hinge, rise up. Let's try that a couple more times. Hip hinge. Keep that low back as long as you can. Lift the belly up toward the sacrum. Make sure the head's not dropping. And then really use your glutes on the way back up so that we're not coming up with those low back muscles. One more time in this staggered stance. And we'll switch. Bring the right foot forward, left foot back, staggering our stance. Soften the knees. So let's try to keep the heels down in that dorsiflexion of the ankles. Hinge forward. So hips move back, torso comes forward. Don't force it. Just keep that lift in the belly, lift in the ribs, push down, rise up. Good. So you can have the feet so much closer together, so much further apart. Customize it for your body, but keep length in the low back. Think about using the glutes and the rest of the core to really support you on the way up and down. We're moving against gravity, so we're going to want to round or just collapse. We've got to use all those stabilizing muscles to help the low back out. One more, hip hinge, nice and long in the spine. Push into the big toes and the heels. Good, rise up. And we'll step together. You can step to either side of the mat. And we'll face the side with the feet parallel. Hands can either come front and back of the pelvis or back of the pelvis and the back of the head. So find that triple S. Let's side lunge at any pace that feels good. So you can stay more upright and still hinge at the hips. You're still getting that nice pull along the inner thighs. You could go a little bit further, but let's keep that feeling of a broom right behind our back. So not dropping the head, not rounding, not overly arching. Ribs are hugging in toward the body. Long in that low back. So let's try to keep as much space as we can in the sides of the body, the waist. And then come up, we'll make our way back to quadruped, back down. And this time, we'll picture a marker or a crayon right at that tailbone. So let's picture that our tailbone can draw some circles with a crayon. And let's circle at least 3 to 5 times both ways. This is really nice to kind of pull and move a lot of tissues that connect to the low back and muscles, but also take some coordination to figure out how to circle. Might feel a little bit awkward. And to whatever amount it feels good for child's pose, you can of course sit back as far as it feels comfortable with the arms forward. You can stay on your forearms and lift the hips. We're gonna side bend and walk the hands a little bit further toward the right. Like we're gonna walk them over to the right corner, lift the ribs up, lift the armpits, breathe into the side and back ribs. Get as much space as you can there. Walk the hands over toward the left corner. So we're in that kind of side stretch, child's pose. Breathing into the ribs, front, side, and back. Let's come back to a seated position. You can just roll the shoulders a little bit, rolling one back at a time. any extra little twist or anything that feels good here with that long spine. And then we'll bring the hands to the ribs and close the eyes. As you inhale, get that expansion side and back as low as you can into the ribs. Take a moment to thank yourself for your practice today. Sending one grateful thought out into the universe.